Imagine you're retiring. You've worked 40 years, paid your taxes, endured countless rush-hour commutes, and finally bought your slice of the Florida dream, a nice little beachfront condo in St. Petersburg. The ocean breeze, the pastel sunsets. You're sipping a margarita on your balcony, thinking you finally made it. Then, you open your mail. It's a notice from your homeowners association. Your monthly HOA fee isn't just going up by a few bucks. It's tripling from $600 to $2,000 a month. Oh, and attached to that is a $50,000 special assessment bill due in 60 days to fix a concrete foundation you didn't even know was cracked. Welcome to Florida in 2026. The Sunshine State's housing market isn't just cooling down. Current trends suggest it is fundamentally fracturing under the weight of climate realities, legislative panic, and an insurance market that functions less like a financial safety net and more like a poorly run casino. Today, we're going to look under the hood of the most chaotic real estate market in America. We will break down the exact mechanics of why Florida real estate is bleeding out, how a tragic building collapse changed the law forever, and why housing inventory is skyrocketing while prices are trapped in a weird, paralyzing standoff. Let's get into it. On the Great Condo Collapse and the Ghost of Surfside. If you want to understand why Florida's housing market is breaking right now, you have to look at the bloodbath happening in the condominium sector. And to understand the mechanics of this, we have to travel back to a deeply tragic night in June 2021. You probably remember the headlines. Champlain Towers South, a 12-story beachfront condominium in Surfside, Florida, pancaked into rubble in the middle of the night. 98 people lost their lives. It was an unthinkable tragedy. But the subsequent investigations revealed a disturbing financial reality. The building didn't just collapse because of salt air and time. It collapsed because of a chronic systemic failure of financial management. The building needed millions of dollars in structural repairs, but the HOA board had spent years delaying the work because the unit owners didn't want to pay the massive special assessments required to fix it. This exposed a massive loophole in Florida real estate mechanics. For decades, Florida condo associations were legally allowed to vote to waive reserve funds. Let me explain how that works, because this is the invisible engine driving today's crisis. In a healthy real estate ecosystem, a portion of your monthly HOA fee goes into a reserve account. This is a giant piggy bank dedicated to replacing the roof in 20 years, fixing the elevator in 15 years, or repairing concrete spalling. But in Florida, condo boards, often driven by retirees on fixed incomes, could literally just hold a vote and say, hey, let's not fund the reserves this year so we can keep our monthly dues at $400. It was essentially a state-sanctioned Ponzi scheme of deferred maintenance. People were kicking the can down the road, hoping they'd be dead or moved out before the roof caved in. In the aftermath of Surfside, the Florida legislature panicked, and rightfully so. In 2022, they passed Senate Bill 4D. This law mandated what are called Structural Integrity Reserve Studies, SIRS, for all condo buildings 3 stories or higher. Furthermore, it explicitly outlawed the practice of waiving reserve funding for critical structural components. The grace period for this law ended as we rolled into 2025. Now, let's look at the nuance here. The strongest argument for this legislation, the Steelman argument, is that this is exactly what a responsible government should do. You cannot have 12-story buildings falling on people. Forcing HOAs to keep cash on hand to maintain structural integrity is a totally rational, necessary policy to ensure public safety. It is the definition of a necessary market correction. But mathematically, it is an absolute localized catastrophe for current owners. According to Democratic State Senator Jason Pizzo, nearly 90% of the 1.6 million condos in Florida are more than 30 years old. Think about the sheer scale of that number. Hundreds of thousands of buildings are suddenly legally required to pass stringent engineering inspections and fully fund their bank accounts to fix decades of ignored decay. The data rolling in throughout 2025 and early 2026 has been staggering. Because associations are now legally forced to catch up on 30 years of deferred maintenance overnight, we are seeing HOA fees explode. It is highly likely that if you are shopping for an older coastal condo right now, you will see monthly HOA dues pushing $1,500, $2,000, or even $3,000 a month. This creates a terrifying trap for the people living there. Imagine you are an 80-year-old widow living on a fixed pension and social security. Your HOA fee doubles. You literally do not have the cash flow to pay it. So what do? You list your condo for sale. But here is where the mechanics of the market break down. Buyers aren't stupid. In early 2026, buyers are demanding transparency. When a prospective buyer sees a $2,500 monthly HOA fee, their mortgage lender practically laughs them out of the room because the debt-to-income ratio no longer makes sense. The result? The data indicates a massive freeze in older condo sales. By August of 2025, Realtor.com reported that Florida condo prices saw their sharpest year-over-year drop since 2010. By early 2026, we are seeing months of supply for condos stretching far beyond a healthy market balance. Inventory is piling up, days on market are stretching to 119 days in some zip codes, and desperate sellers are slashing prices by 10% to 15% just to get out from under the crushing weight of the new fees. Developers are circling like vultures. There is a very real trend emerging in 2026 where developers wait for these older condo associations to essentially go bankrupt or fall into receivership. Once the owners can't pay the assessments, the developer swoops in, buys the entire building at a distressed discount, knocks it down, and builds ultra-luxury units for the ultra-wealthy. It is a brutal, Darwinian economic reset. The old Florida dream of buying a cheap retirement condo on the beach is effectively dead, regulated out of existence by the ghosts of deferred maintenance. But as crazy as the condo collapse is, it's only a fraction of the pain. Because even if you avoid condos and buy a single-family home inland, you still have to deal with the insurance market. And that brings us to the second reason Florida's housing market is fracturing. 2. The insurance math simply doesn't work, even with good news. Imagine you're a young professional couple relocating from Ohio to Tampa. You've saved up your 20% down payment, you found a great 3-bedroom house built in 1995 for $450,000, and you've locked in your mortgage rate. You feel like financial geniuses. But then, 3 days before closing, your lender calls. Your debt-to-income ratio just blew up, and you no longer qualify for the loan. Why? Because the insurance quote came back. To understand why Florida's housing market is sitting in a paralyzing stalemate right now, we have to talk about the insurance market. And here is where we need to apply some serious nuance because the headlines can be incredibly deceiving. Let's look at the strongest argument for the optimistic side. If you listen to state officials in early 2026, they will tell you the insurance crisis has been solved. And to be fair, they have legitimate data to point to. Back in 2022 and 2023, the Florida legislature passed sweeping landmark tort reform. They effectively banned one-way attorney fees and assignment of benefits, AOB loopholes that had turned the state into a litigation factory. For years, Florida accounted for less than 10% of all homeowner claims in the US, but a staggering 80% of all homeowners' insurance lawsuits. It was a lawyer's paradise and a homeowner's nightmare. The reforms worked. By January 2026, Citizens Property Insurance, the state-backed insurer of last resort, saw its policy count plummet from a terrifying peak of over 1.4 million policies down to under 400,000. Even better, Citizens actually announced an 8.7% average statewide rate decrease for 2026. Private insurers are returning to the state. The market, by all technical definitions, is stabilizing. So crisis averted, right? Time to buy that Tampa house? Not quite. Here is where the dark irony of market stabilization comes into play. If you are plummeting in an airplane, and you manage to pull up and stabilize at an altitude of 30,000 feet, you are technically stable. But if you step outside, you are still going to freeze to death because there is no oxygen. That is the Florida insurance market in 2026. It has stabilized at an altitude where normal humans simply cannot breathe. Let the facts provide the shock value here. In 2019, the average cost of homeowners insurance in Florida was roughly $1,988 a year. Fast forward to 2026. While sources vary based on specific coverage limits, data from industry analysts like Bankrate and Insure.com place the average Florida premium anywhere from $4,400 to nearly $6,000. If you are in high-risk coastal areas like Miami-Dade or Broward County, or if your home is older and lacks modern wind mitigation, it is highly likely you are looking at quotes of $7,000 to $10,000 a year, So yes, getting an 8.7% rate cut in 2026 is nice, but an 8% discount on a $7,000 premium that used to cost $2,000 is small comfort when you're trying to balance your household budget. To understand why the floor is so high, we have to explain the mechanics of a financial instrument you never see but pay for every month: reinsurance. Reinsurance is, very simply, insurance for insurance companies. When a local Florida carrier writes 50,000 policies, they know that if a Category 5 hurricane hits Fort Myers, they will instantly owe billions of dollars in claims. They don't have that cash sitting in a checking account, so they buy policies from massive global reinsurance conglomerates based in places like London, Bermuda, and Switzerland. These global reinsurers do not care about Florida politics, they care about math. And their math factors in massive unavoidable variables: the increasing frequency of billion-dollar weather events, the skyrocketing inflation of building materials, concrete, lumber, copper, and the fact that a roof replacement that cost $12,000 in 2018 now costs $25,000. Because global reinsurance capital has become much more expensive to acquire, Florida's domestic insurers pass that cost directly to you, the homeowner, dollar for dollar. Hey, quick pause. If you're enjoying this breakdown of how the economic gears actually turn, hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel out a lot. And let me know in the comments if your own insurance premiums have gone up recently, no matter what state you live in. I read all of them. Okay, back to the housing trap. So how does this actually break the real estate market? It breaks it by destroying the purchasing power of the middle class. When a buyer sits down with a mortgage broker, the bank calculates their PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Banks have strict limits on what percentage of your gross income can go toward that pity payment. Let's go back to our couple moving to Tampa. If the seller of that $450,000 house is stubbornly refusing to lower their asking price because they remember their neighbor selling for $500,000 during the 2021 frenzy, the math simply hits a wall. The mortgage rate is hovering around 6.5%. The property taxes are going to be reassessed at the new purchase price, jumping up significantly. And then the insurance quote comes in at $600 a month. The bank looks at the couple's income and says, "Sorry, your debt-to-income ratio is too high. We cannot legally underwrite this loan." The transaction dies. The current trend we are seeing across Florida is a bizarre psychological standoff. Sellers are anchoring their expectations to the pandemic-era boom, refusing to accept that their homes are worth less today. Buyers physically cannot borrow the money to meet those prices because the carrying costs, taxes and insurance, eat up all their borrowing capacity. The result is a market freezing in place. Inventory is piling up on the MLS. For sale signs are baking in the sun for 90, 120, 150 days. It is a slow-motion crash where prices haven't completely collapsed yet, but the transaction volume has evaporated. And the craziest part? We haven't even talked about the weirdest demographic shift happening right now, which is turning the state's traditional economic engine completely upside down. 3. The demographic U-turn. When the Sunshine State runs out of bartenders. Imagine you are a wealthy private equity manager. You just bought a pristine $4 million waterfront home in Naples. You go out to celebrate your brilliance at that high-end steakhouse downtown. You sit down, eager to drop $300 on a bone-in tomahawk ribeye, and you wait, and you wait. The restaurant is at half capacity, yet there's a 2-hour wait at the door. When you finally sit, your server looks visibly exhausted, sweating through their shirt while running 6 tables at once. You ask the manager what's going on, and he gives you a bleak, hollow stare. We literally cannot find anyone to work here. Why? Because the person supposed to serve you that steak cannot afford to live within a 50-mile radius of the restaurant. Welcome to the third and perhaps most insidious fracture in Florida's housing market, the demographic U-turn. To understand how a localized housing crisis morphs into a full-blown macroeconomic crisis, we have to look at the math of who is actually moving in, and more importantly, who is running for the exits. Let's start with the strongest argument for the Florida is booming narrative. If you look at the absolute GDP numbers and job creation stats released by the state in early 2026, the economy looks like an unstoppable juggernaut. Florida's economy is roughly the size of Spain's. Companies in finance, aerospace and logistics are still setting up shop in Tampa, Orlando and Jacksonville. Unemployment remains remarkably low. The ultra-wealthy are still bringing their capital down I-95 in armoured convoys. On paper, the Florida growth engine is still humming. But look under the hood of the US Census Vintage 2025 data, which dropped in January 2026, and you realise the engine block is cracked. For years, Florida was the undisputed king of domestic migration. During the pandemic boom, hundreds of thousands of Americans flocked south to escape lockdowns and high taxes, but the new data indicates a massive historic slowdown. Florida's net domestic migration absolutely plummeted from its 2022 peaks. By 2025, it ranked 8th in domestic migration, getting beaten out by states like North Carolina and even neighbouring Alabama. And here is where the mechanics of a service-based economy completely break down. An economy built heavily on tourism, hospitality, and retiree care requires a massive, steady supply of working-class and middle-class labour. You need nurses, teachers, HVAC repair techs, roofers, and yes, bartenders. But those people are subject to the brutal, unforgiving math of the cost of living index. According to a revealing November 2025 poll by Florida Atlantic University, a staggering 50% of current Florida residents said they have considered moving out of the state due to the cost of living. Nearly half of the state is looking at their bank accounts and thinking, I cannot mathematically survive this anymore. Furthermore, 43% of respondents reported living paycheck to paycheck. Let's explain the mechanics of why this is happening. Let's say you are a 28-year-old registered nurse in Orlando making $75,000 a year. 5 years ago, you were solidly middle class. You could easily rent a nice apartment or save up to buy a 3-bedroom starter home. Today, your rent has spiked. Your car insurance is routinely ranked among the highest in the nation. Your grocery bill is inflated, and your dream of buying a home is blocked by a 6.5% mortgage rate, coupled with a $5,000 a year homeowner's insurance premium. So, what do? You vote with your feet. The data shows an emerging exodus of young professionals, specifically the 20 to 29-year-old demographic, fleeing the state. They are taking their nursing degrees, their IT certifications, and their teaching licenses to places like Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, and Knoxville, Tennessee. These areas offer comparable job markets, but with housing costs that are 30% to 40% lower, and home insurance premiums that are a fraction of Florida's. But it's not just the young professionals bailing out. It's also the very demographic that built Florida, the retirees. We are witnessing the acceleration of a fascinating demographic trend known as the halfback phenomenon. Here is how the halfback cycle works. A retiree from New York or Ohio moves all the way down to Florida for the sunshine, the golf, and the tax breaks. They stay for 5 or 6 years. Then reality hits. A hurricane tears off their roof, their insurance company drops them or triples their premium, their HOA hands them a $30,000 special assessment to fix a crumbling seawall. Suddenly, that fixed income pension isn't covering the spread, so they pack up and move halfway back north. They settle in the Appalachian foothills of the Carolinas, the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, or the quieter suburbs of Georgia. They get 4 mild seasons, 0 state income tax in TN, and most crucially, they get off the brutal, volatile coastal insurance treadmill. This creates a terrifying structural imbalance for Florida's real estate market. The people moving into the state are increasingly wealthy, cash-heavy buyers who do not rely on local wages. They buy luxury properties in cash, bypassing the mortgage and insurance traps that snare the middle class entirely. They can afford to self-insure. Meanwhile, the people moving out of the state are the very workers needed to maintain those luxury lifestyles and the physical infrastructure of the state itself. When a housing market becomes so expensive that it aggressively evicts its own working class, the underlying economy starts to cannibalize itself. It is highly likely that if these cost of living trends continue, Florida will face severe chronic labor shortages in critical sectors, specifically healthcare, education, and construction. You can build as many luxury condo towers and gated golf communities as you want, but if you price out the plumbers who fix the pipes, the electricians who wire the grid, and the nurses who take care of the aging residents, the ecosystem collapses. It's a bizarre, dark paradox. The housing market is breaking not because people don't want to live in Florida, but because the people who need to live there to keep the state functioning can no longer afford the admission ticket. And speaking of admission tickets, let's talk about the silent, invisible tax that is systematically wiping out property values across the state's most vulnerable zip, codes. It has nothing to do with HOA fees, insurance premiums, or demographic shifts. It has everything to do with Mother Nature, a heavily subsidized government program, and the cold, hard realization that water always wins. 4. The Subsidized Swamp, FEMA's Math Problem and Risk Rating 2.0. Imagine you live in a modest concrete block ranch house in Cape Coral. You aren't a millionaire. You don't have a private yacht docked in the backyard. You live 4 miles inland from the actual Gulf of Mexico, right next to a pleasant little drainage canal. You bought the house in 2015 for $220,000. You've got a dog, a decent lawn, and a pretty quiet life. Then you check your mail. It's your annual National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP renewal. Last year it was $800. This year it's $944, an 18% increase. Annoying, but you pay it. The next year it goes up another 18%, and the year after that. You call your agent furious, demanding to know when the bleeding stops. The agent pulls up your file, sighs, and says, "Well, the government's new algorithm says your home's actual risk premium is $6,500 a year. So, legally, they are just going to keep hiking it by 18% every single year until you hit that number." Welcome to the slow-motion car crash of FEMA's Risk Rating 2.0. To understand why property values in massive swathes of Florida are quietly bleeding out, we have to explain the mechanics of flood insurance. And to do that, we have to acknowledge a dark, open secret about the Sunshine State. Millions of homes were built on land that actively wants to be underwater. For the last 50 years, the federal government basically ran a subsidized charity for coastal real estate. It was called the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP. Before 2021, the NFIP calculated your flood risk using broad, outdated flood maps. If you were inside the Special Flood Hazard Area, SFHA, you paid one rate. If you were outside it, you paid a cheaper rate. But here is the mechanical flaw in that old system. It was incredibly inaccurate, and it heavily subsidized risky behavior. A working-class family living in a $150,000 house in an inland flood zone was often paying the exact same premium as a multimillionaire living in a $4 million beachfront mansion, simply because the old maps didn't account for the replacement cost of the home. Effectively, taxpayers in landlocked states like Nebraska and Iowa were subsidizing the flood risk of vacation homes in Fort Myers and Miami. Let's apply our nuance rule here. The strongest argument for what the government did next, the Steelman argument, is that the old system was financially suicidal and deeply unfair. The NFIP was tens of billions of dollars in debt. You cannot use federal taxpayer money to continuously rebuild houses on sandbars that get obliterated by storm surges every 4 years. A responsible government must price risk accurately to deter people from building in highly dangerous areas. So, FEMA introduced Risk Rating 2.0, which fundamentally changed the math of Florida real estate. Instead of looking at a dumb static map from 1988, Risk Rating 2.0 uses highly sophisticated property-specific algorithms. It looks at the exact elevation of your foundation. It measures the precise distance from your front door to the nearest body of water, whether that's the ocean, a river, or a retention pond. It calculates the frequency of heavy rainfall and, crucially, it factors in the cost to actually rebuild your specific house. The math is completely objective, and it is brutally unforgiving. When Risk Rating 2.0 was fully implemented, the data revealed a shocking reality for Florida. According to FEMA's own projections, around 80% of all NFIP policyholders in Florida saw their premiums increase. But it's the mechanics of how these increases are applied that is trapping homeowners. By federal law, FEMA cannot raise your primary residence's flood premium by more than 18% in a single year. Politicians sold this as a cap to protect consumers. But if you understand basic compound interest, you realize it's actually a financial death sentence. Let the numbers provide the shock value. If your heavily subsidized rate was $1,000, but Risk Rating 2.0 determines your true risk rate should be $5,000, you don't jump to $5,000 overnight. Instead, your premium goes to $1,180. The next year it goes to $1,392. The next year, $1,643. It will mechanically compound by 18% every single year for nearly a decade, until it reaches its terrifying final form. This creates a hidden liability that is destroying home equity. When our friend in Cape Coral decides to sell his house because he can no longer afford the compounding flood insurance on top of his skyrocketing standard homeowner's insurance, he runs into a brick wall. Imagine you are a prospective buyer looking at his house. You ask your mortgage lender for an estimate. The lender pulls up the property and sees that while the current seller is paying $1,392 for flood insurance, the glide path guarantees it will be $4,000 within a few years. Lenders calculate debt-to-income ratios aggressively. Often, they will look at the projected carrying costs of the home and simply deny the mortgage. The buyer walks away, the seller is trapped. Quick engagement check. Do you actually know what flood zone your house is in? Have you checked the new FEMA Risk Rating 2.0 maps for your area? Let me know in the comments if you've been hit by these invisible 18% hikes, because the stories I'm reading on real estate forums are absolutely wild. We are seeing this exact scenario play out across the Tampa Bay area, Southwest Florida, and Miami-Dade County in 2026. Properties that look perfectly affordable on Zillow are actually radioactive financial assets. If a house requires flood insurance, and in Florida, if you have a mortgage in a high-risk zone, it is federally mandated, the escalating cost of that insurance acts like a dark gravity, pulling the value of the home down. And the psychological impact of this is profound. Floridians have historically treated flood insurance like a minor tax. Now, it is becoming a dominant expense. Some homeowners, once they finally pay off their 30-year mortgages and are no longer legally forced by a bank to carry flood insurance, are simply dropping their policies entirely. They are going bare, choosing to self-insure against Mother Nature. Current trends suggest that as we push deeper into the 2020s, a massive portion of Florida's housing wealth will be completely uninsured against rising water. One direct hit from a Category 4 storm, pushing a 15-foot storm surge into an area where 60% of the homes have dropped their NFIP policies, won't just destroy buildings, it will permanently vaporize generational wealth overnight, leaving the local economy with no mechanism to rebuild. But water coming from the outside isn't the only infrastructure crisis threatening Florida's housing market. To understand the next massive fracture, we have to look underground. We have to talk about a literal ticking time bomb sitting beneath the lawns of over 2.6 million Florida homes, quietly threatening to poison the water supply and bankrupt local municipalities. 5. The underground time bomb. 2.7 million leaking secrets. Imagine you're mowing the lawn of your new home in Brevard County. The sun is shining, the grass is suspiciously, almost unnaturally green, and you're feeling great about finally escaping the frozen winters of the Midwest. But what you don't realize is that beneath that lush, emerald green turf lies a ticking financial time bomb, completely invisible to the naked eye. I'm talking about your septic tank. If you want to understand the next massive, unavoidable tax on Florida real estate, we have to look underground. Florida has an estimated 2.7 million septic systems, representing roughly 12% of all the septic tanks in the entire United States. And the mechanics of how these systems are interacting with a changing environment is creating a multi-billion-dollar crisis that is about to be handed directly to the homeowner. Let's explain the mechanics of a septic system without the hype. Traditional septic tanks are incredibly simple, almost ancient technology. Wastewater leaves your house, enters a concrete or fiberglass tank where the solids settle, and the liquid effluent flows out into a drain field. The drain field is essentially a network of perforated pipes buried in dirt. As the liquid trickles down through the soil, natural bacteria filter out the nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, before the water reaches the underground aquifer. Notice the critical variable in that equation: dry soil. A septic system legally and mechanically requires a minimum barrier of dry dirt between the drain field and the water table to function properly. Now, let's introduce the reality of Florida's geography in the 2020s. As sea levels rise, and the data consistently indicates the water around Florida is rising by fractions of an inch every year, it pushes the underground freshwater table up with it. That buffer of dry dirt shrinks. In coastal and low-lying inland areas, the soil is becoming permanently saturated. When a drain field sits in wet soil, the bacteria literally drown. They can't do their job. The system fails. But it doesn't fail spectacularly by backing up into your bathtub. It fails invisibly. The raw, nutrient-rich wastewater flows completely unfiltered directly into the groundwater, the local canals, the Indian River Lagoon, and eventually the ocean. And what happens when you pump millions of gallons of nitrogen and phosphorus into warm, shallow, slow-moving waterways? You get apocalyptic algae blooms. You get the infamous red tide. It literally chokes the oxygen out of the water, kills millions of fish, devastates local tourism, and releases aerosolized neurotoxins into the air that make it physically painful to breathe on the beach. Let's apply our nuance rule here. The strongest argument for what local governments are doing to fix this, the steelman argument, is that they have absolutely no choice. If Florida doesn't stop pumping human waste into its waterways, the state's entire economic engine will seize up. Nobody is paying $3,000 a week to rent an Airbnb that smells like rotting manatees. Local and state governments are entirely correct in deciding that this infrastructure must be modernized immediately. It is an existential requirement. Like Volusia, Brevard, and Martin like Volusia, Brevard and Martin counties have begun passing strict mandates. The solution is twofold. Either the local government digs up the streets, runs central municipal sewer lines, and legally forces you to abandon your septic tank and hook up to the grid, or you're forced to install an advanced nutrient-reducing septic system. Let the numbers speak for itself. If the city runs a sewer line to your street, you don't just get to politely decline, you are mandated to connect. And the bill for the utility connection fee, the impact fee, the private plumber to run the pipes to your house, and the cost to legally crush and fill your old septic tank falls squarely on you. Depending on the county and the specific logistics of your property, these mandatory septic to sewer conversions are costing homeowners anywhere from $10,000 to upwards of $25,000 per property. If you live outside the new sewer expansion zones, the state will eventually refuse to issue permits to repair your old, failing traditional septic tank. You will be forced to buy an advanced aerobic system. Those currently cost between $15,000 and $20,000 to install, plus mandatory annual inspections and maintenance contracts that cost hundreds of dollars a year. Imagine being that middle-class family we talked about earlier. You scrape together enough to buy a modest starter home, and 3 years later the city sends you a letter saying, "Congratulations on the new sewer line. You owe us $18,000 by the end of the year." Now the government knows you don't have $18,000 sitting in a checking account. So what do? They graciously allow you to amortize the cost over 10 or 20 years by placing a special assessment directly on your property tax bill. And just like that, the carrying cost of the house jumps yet again. Your monthly payment swells. And when you try to sell the house, the new buyer's mortgage lender looks at that massive special assessment tax, recalculates the debt-to-income ratio, and denies the loan. It is a slow, methodical financial suffocation. Between skyrocketing condo HOA fees, $6,000 insurance premiums, compounding FEMA flood rates, and now $20,000 sewer conversion mandates, the actual asking price of the home on Zillow is becoming increasingly irrelevant. It's the cost of keeping the home that is breaking the market. And this brings us to a psychological tipping point. When carrying costs explode this violently and this unpredictably, it fundamentally changes how large-scale investors view Florida real estate. It turns out the smart money is already packing its bags. Let's talk about the institutional investor exodus and why the Wall Street landlords are quietly sneaking out the back door while retail buyers are still trying to get in. 6. The institutional exodus, why Wall Street is quietly packing its bags. Imagine you are a senior risk analyst at a massive private equity fund in Manhattan. It's 8 a.m. on a Tuesday in early 2026. Your firm owns a portfolio of 5,000 single-family rental homes scattered across Orlando, Tampa, and Jacksonville. You aren't some mustache-twirling villain out of a comic book. You're simply a math nerd who worships at the altar of yield. You don't care about Florida's pastel sunsets, the beach access, or the local theme parks. You care about the spreadsheet in front of you. And right now, the cells on that spreadsheet are flashing warning signs. You walk down the hall, knock on the portfolio manager's door, and deliver the bad news. We need to sell the Florida houses. For the last 4 years, the dominant narrative in American real estate has been that Wall Street is buying up your neighborhood. We've all seen the headlines about massive mega corporations outbidding regular families with all-cash offers, turning the American dream into a permanent rental subscription. But if you look at the actual data rolling in right now, current trends suggest a massive, under-the-radar reversal is taking place in the Sunshine State. The smart money is quietly, methodically heading for the exits. To understand why, we have to ignore the hype and look at the exact mechanics of how institutional real estate investing actually works. It all comes down to a metric called the capitalization rate, or cap rate. The cap rate is incredibly simple to understand. You take the net operating income of a property, the rent you collect minus the expenses to maintain it, and divide it by the property's value. If you buy a house for $300,000 and it generates $15,000 a year in pure profit after expenses, your cap rate is 5%. During the pandemic boom of 2021 and 2022, Wall Street aggressively bought Florida real estate because the cap rates were fantastic. Borrowing money was virtually free, property taxes were based on old assessments, insurance was manageable, and a flood of new residents meant you could raise the rent by 20% a year without anyone blinking. It was a gold rush. Now, fast forward to 2026, apply the mechanics we've already talked about to Wall Street's spreadsheet. That same $300,000 house is now theoretically worth $450,000. But the expenses have completely decoupled from reality. The property taxes have been reassessed at the new higher value. The homeowner's insurance premium just jumped from $1,800 to $6,000. The local government just slapped a $15,000 mandatory sewer conversion assessment on the tax bill. And because the local working class is being squeezed to death by inflation, you can no longer aggressively raise the rent. In fact, in many Florida markets, rent growth has flatlined or even slightly declined because the local demographic simply cannot absorb another hike. Suddenly, your net operating income plummets. Your cap rate drops from a healthy 5% down to a miserable 2.5% or 3%. Here is the mechanical breaking point. Why would a Wall Street fund take on the massive headache of managing 5,000 physical houses, dealing with hurricanes, leaky roofs, and tenant turnover for a 3% return when they can take that same billions of dollars, buy US Treasury bonds, and get a completely risk-free zero-maintenance return of over 4%? The math says they wouldn't, and the data proves they aren't. Now let's acknowledge the nuance here. The strongest argument against this narrative is that if you look at the headline numbers, investors still make up a huge chunk of home purchases. In fact, data from Batch Data in 2025 showed that investors accounted for roughly 33% of single-family home purchases nationally. So, Wall Street is still taking over, right? Wrong. You have to look at who those investors actually are. The data indicates that a staggering 87% of those investor-owned homes belong to mom-and-pop landlords, regular people who own between 1 and 5 properties. They are the ones still trying to make the math work, often catching a falling knife. The mega corporations, the institutional investors holding 1,000 or more properties, are doing the exact opposite. According to that same batch data tracking going into late 2025 and 2026, the largest institutional investors have been net sellers for 6 consecutive quarters. They are aggressively pruning their portfolios. Redfin data confirms this localized bloodbath, showing that investor purchases recently plummeted by nearly 28% year over year in Orlando, the largest drop of any major US metro, with Miami and Tampa close behind. Hey, real quick, if you appreciate this level of objective, data-driven analysis that cuts through the usual internet hype, do me a favor and hit the like button, and let me know in the comments. Are you seeing more for rent or for sale signs in your specific neighborhood right now? It helps me track what's happening on the ground, and if the brutal mathematics of cap rates weren't enough to scare Wall Street away, 2026 introduced a massive new variable: extreme political risk. Institutional landlords have become public enemy number 1. In early 2026, we saw aggressive political maneuvers at the highest federal levels, including proposed executive orders and bipartisan congressional bills aimed at outright banning or severely restricting large institutional investors from purchasing single-family homes. Regardless of whether these specific bans pass into permanent law, the message to Wall Street is crystal clear. The regulatory environment has turned violently hostile. Capital hates uncertainty. When a private equity fund sees that their business model might literally be outlawed or heavily taxed to the point of unprofitability, they don't stick around to fight a losing PR war. They liquidate. This institutional exodus creates a fascinating and highly dangerous dynamic for Florida's housing supply. For years, whenever a house sat on the market for too long, a corporate buyer would swoop in with an all-cash offer, effectively establishing a price floor for the neighborhood. They were the ultimate safety net for sellers. Today, that safety net is gone. The corporate buyers have turned into corporate sellers. They are quietly offloading thousands of homes back onto the MLS just as everyday buyers are completely paralysed by 6.5% mortgage rates and $6,000 insurance premiums. When you increase the supply of homes for sale while simultaneously vaporizing the demand, basic economic laws dictate that a price correction isn't just possible, it is an absolute mechanical certainty. But to fully grasp how far prices might actually correct, we have to look at the psychological shift happening with the one group of people who are supposed to be the bedrock of the real estate market. We need to talk about the terrifying new reality of the trapped seller. 7. The golden handcuffs. Why Florida sellers are literally trapped. Imagine you're sitting at your kitchen table in Jupiter, Florida. You just had your third child. The walls are closing in, the toys are multiplying, and you desperately need a bigger house. You bought your current 3-bedroom home back in the magical free money era of 2021 for $400,000, locking in a beautiful 2.9% mortgage rate. You pull up Zillow and smile. Your house is now estimated to be worth $600,000. Congratulations, you're a real estate genius. You have $200,000 in equity just sitting there. You decide to sell, take that massive pile of cash, and buy a modest $750,000 4-bedroom house, just 3 miles down the road in a better school district. Then, you sit down with a mortgage broker and actually do the math. And the math violently ruins your day. To understand why Florida's housing market is sitting in a state of paralyzed gridlock in 2026, we have to look at the psychology and the brutal mechanics of the trapped seller. It is a phenomenon driven by a toxic cocktail of national interest rates and a highly specific Florida tax mechanic that effectively punishes you for moving. Let's start with the national mechanic, the mortgage lock-in effect. In 2021, you were paying 2.9% interest to borrow money. In early 2026, the average 30-year fixed mortgage is hovering right around 6.3%. If you swap your $400,000 house for a $750,000 house, your principal loan amount obviously goes up, but your interest rate more than doubles. That alone adds thousands of dollars a year to your carrying costs. But this is Florida, which means we have to supercharge the pain with local legislation. We have to talk about the Save Our Homes (SOH) amendment. If you aren't from Florida, you probably don't know how SOH works, but it is the invisible gravity controlling the entire state's property tax system. Passed in the 1990s, the Save Our Homes cap legally restricts the assessed value of a primary homesteaded residence from increasing by more than 3%, or the rate of inflation, whichever is lower per year. Let's explain the mechanics of how this traps you. Because you bought your house in 2021, the county has only been allowed to raise your taxable value by a maximum of 3% a year. So, while your home's market value shot up to $600,000 on Zillow, your assessed value for tax purposes might only be sitting at $440,000. You're paying property taxes on an artificially suppressed number. Now you go buy that new $750,000 house. When a property changes hands in Florida, the Save Our Homes cap on that specific property is immediately stripped away. The property is legally reassessed at its full, current just value on January 1st of the following year. Yes, Florida has a portability feature that allows you to transfer a portion of your tax savings to the new house. But portability is arguably one of the most misunderstood mechanics in Florida real estate. It does not transfer your old tax bill. It transfers your assessed differential, subject to a $500,000 cap. If you trade up to a more expensive home, you're still going to take a massive hit on the difference between your old home's value and the new sticker price. The county always gets its pound of flesh. So let's look at your new reality. Your mortgage rate just went from 2.9% to 6.3%. Your property tax basis instantly reset to reflect a $750,000 purchase price. And because it's 2026, your new homeowner's insurance quote isn't the $1,800 you were paying in 2021. It's the new unsubsidized market rate of $6,500. You add up the new principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, PITI. Your monthly payment doesn't just go up by a few $100, it nearly triples. You look at your spouse, close the Zillow tab and say, "We aren't moving, we'll just put a bunk bed in the home office." Welcome to the golden handcuffs. You're a millionaire on paper, but your paper millions are trapped inside a house you can no longer afford to leave. Let's apply some nuance here and look at the steelman argument. The strongest argument for the current market dynamic is that, unlike the catastrophic 2008 crash, today's homeowners are incredibly financially stable. They have fixed, low monthly payments and record amounts of equity. According to national data going into 2026, roughly 4 out of every 5 homeowners with a mortgage have a rate below 6%. The system isn't collapsing under the weight of subprime adjustable rate mortgages. Homeowners are completely bulletproof as long as they don't move. But here is where you dismantle that optimism. A healthy, functioning real estate market requires people to move. Real estate is supposed to be a conveyor belt. The young professional buys the starter condo. 5 years later, they sell it to buy a 3-bedroom house to start a family. 10 years later, they sell that to buy the 4-bedroom suburban dream. 30 years later, they downsize back into a condo, freeing up the big house for the next generation. In Florida in 2026, that conveyor belt has completely seized up. The lock-in effect has removed almost all discretionary sellers from the market. The only people selling everyday homes are those experiencing major, unavoidable life events: death, divorce, job relocation, or severe financial distress. This creates a bizarre cognitive dissonance in the market data. According to Realtor.com's 2026 economic outlook, active inventory has been rising. There are more homes sitting on the market. You would naturally think that means prices should immediately crash. But the relationship between supply and demand has weakened because the quality of the supply is warped, and the buyers are completely exhausted by the carrying costs. Sellers are anchoring their asking prices to the peak of 2022 because they feel they need top dollar to mathematically justify the financial pain of giving up their 3% mortgage. They list their house for $650,000, expecting a bidding war. Instead, they get crickets. Buyers physically cannot afford those peak prices at 6.3% interest when forced to underwrite the new, uncapped property taxes and a massive insurance policy. The bank's debt-to-income algorithms simply reject the application. So, the market enters a state of sclerosis. Houses sit on the market for 100, 120, 140 days. Sellers stubbornly refuse to drop their prices, buyers stubbornly refuse, or are mathematically unable to meet them. It is a giant game of financial chicken playing out on front lawns across the state. And while everyday homeowners are locked in a staring contest, a totally different, highly aggressive sector of the market is actively preparing to flood the streets with new inventory, completely ignoring the stalemate. Which brings us to the builders, the backlog, and the reality of the new construction illusion. 8. The builder backlog. Why new construction is cannibalizing the market. Imagine you're the trapped seller we just talked about. Let's say you finally bite the bullet. You accept that your pity is going to skyrocket, but you absolutely have to move. You list your beautifully maintained 2015 built Florida home for $500,000. You hire a photographer, you bake cookies for the open house, and you wait for the offers to roll in. A month goes by, nothing. 2 months, you drop the price to $480,000, still nothing. You call your real estate agent, frustrated, demanding to know why nobody's even looking at your house. Your agent sighs and tells you to drive 3 miles down the road to the new master plan development that just cleared 500 acres of swampland. You drive over there. There is a giant inflatable gorilla outside the sales center and a banner that reads, "Brand new 4-bedroom homes, starting at $460,000 plus a 4.99% fixed interest rate and $15,000 toward closing costs. Congratulations! You brought a plate of warm cookies to a financial gunfight, and your opponent is a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded corporation that effectively prints its own mortgages." If you want to understand why the existing resale market in Florida is breaking, you have to look at how new construction builders are ruthlessly, mechanically cannibalizing the buyer pool. And to do that, we have to look at a historical anomaly in the data that is flipping the real estate world upside down. Let the facts provide the shock value here. Historically, for decades, new construction homes carried a 10% to 15% price premium over existing homes. You paid more for the privilege of being the first person to use the toilets, having a brand new roof, and getting a modern floor plan. But going into 2026, the National Association of Realtors and Industry Analysts pointed out a bizarre, unexpected dynamic. The The median resale home is now frequently more expensive than the median newly built home. This has only happened a handful of times in modern American history. The script has completely flipped. But how? How can a brand new house with a 2026 compliant roof, hurricane impact windows, and zero deferred maintenance cost less per month than a 10-year-old house that still needs a $20,000 sewer conversion? It all comes down to the mechanics of corporate finance and spec homes. Let's explain the mechanics without the hype. Over the last few years, national builders, the massive companies you see trading on Wall Street, bought up massive tracts of land across central and southwest Florida. Because the market was so hot, they didn't wait for a buyer to pick out a lot and choose their cabinet colours. They just started pouring concrete. They built thousands of speculative homes, often called spec homes or quick move-in QMI inventory. A mum-and-pop seller has an emotional attachment to their home. They look at their kitchen and think, we had our first Thanksgiving here, this house is worth $500,000 and I refuse to take a penny less. A corporate home builder has zero emotions. They have shareholders, quarterly earnings calls, and millions of dollars tied up in carrying costs, financing, and property taxes for empty houses. A finished spec home sitting empty is a financial liability burning cash every single day. When buyer demand cooled off due to 6.5% mortgage rates, builders panicked. But unlike regular sellers, they had a massive financial lever they could pull, their in-house financing arms. If a builder needs to move 50 houses before the end of the quarter, they don't just drop the asking price. They use a portion of their profit margin to literally buy down the buyer's mortgage rate. Instead of a buyer going to a local bank and getting hit with a 6.5% rate, the builder's in-house lender offers them a permanent 4.99% rate, or a temporary 2-1 buy down, where the rate starts in the 4% range for the first couple of years. For a buyer, the math is a no-brainer. Current trends suggest that an $80,000 price cut on a resale home doesn't lower your monthly payment nearly as much as a 1.5% interest rate drop on a new build. Plus, the builder throws in $15,000 to cover all your closing costs, and maybe even a free appliance package. In Southwest Florida right now, we are seeing some builders slash $50,000 to $100,000 off the original list price of standing inventory homes just to get them off the books. Now, let's apply our nuance rule. The strongest argument for this dynamic is that the builders are actually saving the housing market. They are the only ones providing an affordable entry point for first-time buyers and young families who have been entirely priced out of the resale market by greedy sellers and high rates. Builders are acting rationally, providing supply where there is a massive deficit of affordable options. It's a win for the consumer. But if you look at the systemic mechanics, this builder dumping is devastating the liquidity of the secondary market. Because the builders are hoarding all the qualified buyers with their unbeatable financial incentives, the everyday sellers, the ones who have to move for a job relocation or a divorce, are left starving for foot traffic. Inventory piles up. According to 2025 and 2026 data, active inventory in places like Tampa, Orlando, and Cape Coral has surged. But it's a toxic kind of inventory, a standoff between stubborn resale sellers who mathematically cannot afford to lower their prices and aggressive corporate builders who are flooding the zone with discounted spec homes. And the dark irony here, the builders themselves are starting to realize they might be building a bridge to nowhere. Recent data indicates that the new home frenzy is showing deep signs of fatigue. Redfin reported a significant drop in the share of single-family homes for sale that were new construction, pointing out that local builders in saturated markets are actually beginning to lay off workers. Housing starts, the metric tracking when new foundations are poured, have begun to edge lower. Builders are looking at the same demographic data and insurance nightmares we talked about earlier, and they are quietly tapping the brakes on future projects. They are heavily incentivizing the homes they already built, but they are terrified to start building the next phase. This creates a brutal, probabilistic outcome for Florida's immediate future. We are highly likely entering a period where the existing housing stock stagnates, while the new housing pipeline slowly chokes itself off due to vanishing profitability. The market isn't just correcting, it is structurally fracturing into two completely separate realities. You have the heavily subsidized, corporate-backed new builds moving at a discount, and you have the frozen, expensive, insurance-saddled resale homes collecting dust. And caught in the middle are the local municipalities, who are suddenly realizing that a frozen real estate market means their tax revenues are about to hit a brick wall. Which brings us to the ultimate consequence of this entire crisis. What happens when the state that has famously built its entire identity around having zero income tax suddenly runs out of real estate transactions to fund its government? Let's talk about the silent collapse of the Florida budget model. Quick check-in. Have you noticed massive new subdivisions popping up in your area, only to see price-reduced signs a few months later? Let me know in the comments. The localized data on this is fascinating to track. 9. The tax revenue trap. The silent collapse of the Florida budget model. Imagine you are the mayor of a mid-sized coastal city in Florida. It's early 2026. You just got off a brutal phone call with your public works director who needs another $10 million to upgrade the municipal sewer lines because the rising water table is drowning the local septic systems. You hang up, take a deep breath, and open your city's budget projections for the next fiscal year. The numbers staring back at you are terrifying. Your expenses are skyrocketing due to inflation, climate adaptation, and infrastructure mandates. But your revenue engine is violently stalling out. You realize, with a cold sweat, that the entire financial model of your city, and arguably the entire state of Florida, is built on a foundational premise that is rapidly ceasing to exist: constant, explosive real estate growth. If you want to understand the true macroeconomic danger of Florida's breaking housing market, you have to look past the individual buyer and seller. You have to look at how the government actually pays its bills. Let's explain the mechanics of the Florida miracle. Florida famously has absolutely zero state income tax. It is the ultimate marketing pitch that has drawn millions of retirees and wealthy executives down to 95. But bridges, schools, police departments, and fire rescues are not free. So, how does the state fund a massive economy without taking a cut of your paycheck? It relies almost entirely on consumption and real estate. Specifically, it relies heavily on the documentary stamp tax at the state level and local property taxes at the municipal level. The documentary stamp tax, or doc stamps, is essentially a tax on the velocity of money. Whenever a deed is recorded or a mortgage is signed, the state takes a cut. During the pandemic boom of 2021 and 2022, when houses were trading hands every 6 months in wild bidding wars, doc stamp revenue exploded, filling the state coffers with billions in surplus cash. But remember the golden handcuffs we talked about in Section 7? Because mortgage rates are hovering in the 6% range and insurance costs are astronomical, transaction volume in the resale market has plummeted. The real estate conveyor belt has seized up. People are not moving, and when people don't move, deeds aren't recorded and mortgages aren't originated. Mathematically, the state's doc stamp revenue begins to aggressively bleed out. You cannot fund a government on the velocity of real estate when the real estate stops moving. But the doc stamp decline is just a paper cut compared to the existential threat facing local municipalities. The Great Property Tax Revolt of 2025 and 2026. Here is the mechanical reality of local Florida government. Property taxes are the financial backbone of the state. Across all counties, cities, and school districts, property taxes generate roughly $55 billion annually. For many local governments, particularly smaller or fiscally constrained rural counties, property taxes account for an overwhelming majority of their general revenue. But as we established, the carrying cost of a Florida home has become utterly toxic to the middle class. Between insurance premiums, HOA special assessments, and inflation, homeowners are suffocating. The political pressure has reached a boiling point, leading to a massive, highly publicized push by state leadership in 2025 and 2026 to drastically reduce, or even completely abolish, homestead property taxes. Let's apply our nuance rule here. The strongest argument for abolishing property taxes is incredibly compelling, and it's deeply rooted in the American ethos. Proponents argue that if you have to pay the government thousands of dollars every year just to exist in a house you've already paid off, you don't actually own your home. You are simply renting it from the state. Abolishing the homestead tax would instantly provide massive financial relief to millions of struggling Floridians, theoretically offsetting the pain of their massive insurance premiums. It would make true home ownership a reality. It sounds like a libertarian utopia, but mathematically, it is a fiscal high-wire act with no safety net. If the state eliminates the homestead portion of the property tax, they are blowing a roughly $19 billion hole in local government budgets overnight. How do you fill a $19 billion hole when you have no state income tax and your real estate transaction volume is in the gutter? The data leaves only a few dark, probabilistic outcomes. First, you aggressively hike the sales tax. Economic analysts looking at the 2026 legislative proposals estimate that to replace the lost property tax revenue, Florida would have to increase its general sales tax from 6% to upwards of 9% or even 12%. This would make Florida's sales tax the highest in the nation. It would violently shift the tax burden away from wealthy property owners, who can easily afford their mansions, and directly onto the backs of the working-class service workers, young renters, and tourists who would pay a premium for every gallon of gas, every pair of shoes, and every meal. Second, you introduce aggressive new user fees. You might not pay property tax, but suddenly it costs $25 to park at the public beach, your municipal water bill doubles, and your local trash collection fee triples. Third, and most dangerously, local governments simply gut their services. The math indicates that in many Florida, cities, police, fire, and emergency medical services make up more than 50% of the local budget. You cannot trim $19 billion in fat without cutting into bone. Current trends suggest that if these revenues are slashed without a guaranteed dollar-for-dollar state replacement, emergency response times will widen, critical infrastructure maintenance will be deferred, and local schools will be starved of resources. This creates a terrifying feedback loop for the housing market. Why would a family want to buy a $600,000 house in a neighborhood where the police department is underfunded, the local school is laying off teachers, and the roads are crumbling? The state is effectively trapped in a financial catch-22. If they do nothing, the skyrocketing carrying costs, taxes plus insurance plus HOAs, will continue to price the middle class out, stalling the housing market and cannibalizing the service economy. If they aggressively cut property taxes to save the homeowners, they risk bankrupting the local municipalities that make the state livable in the first place. It is a slow-burning crisis of basic arithmetic. And as the political battles rage over how to balance this impossible ledger, the actual physical reality of the state continues to deteriorate, which brings us to the final and most undeniable reason why Florida's housing market is breaking. It has nothing to do with politics, insurance models, or tax codes. It has to do with the physical limits of a peninsula built on limestone and sand. 10. The limestone trap, why you can't just build a wall. Imagine you're a city planner in South Florida. You're standing on a multi-million-dollar seawall during a perfectly sunny afternoon. There's not a cloud in the sky, no hurricane in the forecast, but as high tide rolls in, you watch in horror as ocean water doesn't come over your brand new wall. It bubbles up from the storm drains behind you, floods the streets, and begins pooling in the lobbies of luxury high-rises. You just spent a fortune trying to lock the front door, and the ocean simply came up through the floorboards. If you want to understand the final, undeniable reason why Florida's housing market has a hard, physical ceiling on its future growth, you have to look at the ground you're standing on. You have to understand the mechanics of karst topography. The strongest argument against the Florida is doomed narrative is that human engineering is incredible. We've tamed nature before, just look at Miami Beach. In recent years, they initiated a massive $400 to $500 million public works project. They literally raised the elevation of their roads by over 2 feet and installed massive state-of-the-art water pumps. During recent king tides, local officials celebrated because those specific raised streets stayed completely dry. The argument is that with enough capital and innovation, Florida can simply outbuild the water. But here is where the mechanical reality of geology absolutely dismantles the engineering optimism. Florida is not built on solid bedrock. It is built on porous limestone. Think of it less like a solid foundation and more like a rigid calcium-rich sponge. Because the ground is essentially a network of microscopic and sometimes macroscopic holes, traditional coastal defense mechanisms physically cannot work. When you build a massive seawall in New York or the Netherlands, it works because it is anchored into non-permeable earth. When you build a seawall in South Florida, the ocean simply goes underneath the wall, travels through the porous limestone, and is pushed up to the surface by hydrostatic pressure. This is the mechanical cause of Florida's infamous sunny day flooding. But the flooding of streets is actually the lesser of the two evils caused by this porous rock. The true existential threat to the state's real estate lies in what is happening to the drinking water. Sitting inside that porous limestone is the Biscayne Aquifer, a massive shallow underground lake that provides the sole source of drinking water for millions of residents in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. Because the rock is so permeable, the freshwater aquifer is constantly engaged in a delicate, invisible war with the Atlantic Ocean. Historically, the sheer volume and pressure of the freshwater pushing out toward the coast kept the saltwater at bay, but current trends suggest that defense line is breaking. Between excessive groundwater pumping to support a booming population, the historical draining of the Everglades, and the steady rise in sea levels pushing heavier saltwater inland, the ocean is winning. We are seeing aggressive, measurable saltwater intrusion. The ocean is literally bleeding into the drinking water. This isn't a theoretical projection for 2050, it is already happening. Coastal cities like Dania Beach and Hallandale Beach have literally had to shut down and abandon municipal freshwater well fields because the water pulled from the ground became too salty to drink. You cannot build a seawall to protect an aquifer from below. So, what is the engineering solution to a sponge that is filling with salt water? You have to build complex inland desalination plants, dramatically expand your surface, water reservoirs, or pump water from much deeper, harder to reach aquifers. All of these solutions are astronomically expensive. And this brings us back to the core thesis of this entire video, the compounding cost of carrying the state. When Miami Beach spent $500 million to raise its roads and install pumps, that money didn't materialize out of thin air. They funded it, in part, by hitting residents with an 84% increase in stormwater fees. And here is the dark, tragic irony of raising roads. Water obeys gravity. If the city raises the street by 2 feet, but you can't afford the hundreds of thousands of dollars to raise your 1970s house to match it, the street is now a dam. When it rains, all the water runs off the brand new dry municipal road and funnels directly into your lower elevation living room. The physical reality of Florida's limestone foundation guarantees that adapting to the environment will require an infinite, unwinnable financial arms race. And as local, municipalities are forced to pass those billion-dollar engineering costs down to the taxpayer through utility hikes, special assessments, and elevated property taxes. The middle-class homeowner will simply be crushed under the weight of the bill. 11. Final thoughts, the reality check. So, let's summarize exactly what we've learned today. Florida's housing market isn't breaking because of a single, catastrophic event like the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. It is breaking because of a highly complex interconnected web of compounding costs. We have condo owners being bankrupted by the ghosts of deferred maintenance and new state laws. We have a stabilized but suffocating insurance market that is mechanically locking buyers out of mortgages. We have a demographic U-turn where the working class is fleeing, replaced by a wealthy elite who don't rely on local wages. We have FEMA's compounding 18% flood insurance hikes silently destroying home equity. We have $20,000 septic to sewer mandates handed directly to middle-class families. We have Wall Street aggressively dumping their portfolios because the math no longer yields a profit. We have everyday sellers trapped by golden handcuffs, completely cannibalized by corporate builders dumping spec homes at massive discounts. And wrapping it all up, we have a state government heavily reliant on a real estate transaction velocity that has fundamentally flatlined, sitting on top of a porous limestone sponge that actively resists coastal defense. The lesson here is simple, but deeply uncomfortable. A real estate market can look perfectly healthy on a macroeconomic GDP spreadsheet, while simultaneously rotting from the inside out. Current data indicates that the era of Florida serving as the cheap, easy, sunshine-filled escape for the American middle class is highly likely over. The admission ticket has simply become too expensive, and the ongoing maintenance fees are mathematically unsustainable for the average family. If you found this deep dive valuable, do me a favor and share it with someone who is currently thinking about buying real estate in the Sunshine State. They need to know the actual mechanics of what they are walking into. If you want to see how this compares to what is happening out west, watch out for our upcoming full breakdown of the California housing exodus. Thanks for watching, stay smart out there, and I'll see you in the next one.